Well, good Mother's Day and Sunday afternoon, everyone. This is a picture of the NIH Clinical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. I was a patient at in 1962. Here's another view back in 2004 from the entranceway. And um, today I want to talk about um, my recent correspondence with HRC. And they're one of my beneficiaries of my trust, along with a few other nonprofits and one individual. And so I wanted to that's Human Rights Campaign. Okay, so you remember. And I have not been giving them uh, a monthly donation recently because of my disagreement over gender identity. But they're still a beneficiary and it creates an issue. So I want to go over where I stand on it and in detail today, and just then show you the letter I sent to them, and we'll take it from there. Um, First of all, let me just go through the facts as best I can tell what they are. I went through Microsoft Copilot on Bing and just asked a few questions and did a little bit of other research. But I asked what percentage of public school kids actually change their names and pronouns. And it came back and said that 50% of schools encourage, right now in the United States, encourage this to be done. And there's the link there, and I can bring it up. And then I asked what percentage of kids say that they are transgender. And NBC News and ABC News both had a story, um, but that's a little bit deceptive because um, really these kids really are just gender nonconforming the way I was. Most of them don't have a recognized medical explanation. They're not intersex or with a DSD, and although they may have, there is one neurological issue, what they call the homunculus, where your brain doesn't have a clear, your central nervous system doesn't have a good map of how easily to interact with all of your internal organs. That's a little bit unclear whether that's part of the DSDs. That needs a lot more work than we've had right now. So that's the one issue I'm kind of concerned about. That's been talked about in Quora, but we don't have really good information about it. But back in 2023, in May of 2023, I gave you some NIH references on. I'll give you the date for that link in the description. And then what percent of public school kids actually use puberty blockers? And it's less than 0.1%, which is less than 1 in 1,000. And I think that that's very interesting because that means the logical conclusion that even though kids are claiming to be transgender or claiming to be at least gender nonconforming, which is really what it is, probably a much lower percentage of them actually request name and pronoun changes and do the pronoun thing, which is being taught these days and became popular in the second half of the last decade and sort of became disruptive to a lot of people. But this, the very minor, once in a blue moon, this probably happened even 30 years ago in the 90s that parents would want to do this, but it was very infrequent. But it did happen in the distant past, although very, very rarely. Then the biggest question, well, so as I say, probably the overall impression is less than 1% of kids in the United States actually try to do that. So it's maybe not as big as the right is making it look. So I'm just trying to be as objective as possible. Then what's the legal definition of gender identity? Well, in the United States law. That seems to be very hard to track down, but I did look it up in the Cornell Law Center. And gender identity, it says that gender identity is a person's self-identified gender. That's being circular already, which may or may not correspond to the sex assigned at birth. It's how a person expresses and experiences, expresses their gender. They mention the Yogyakarta principles of international human rights revolving sexual orientation and gender identity. They describe gender identity as each person's presentation of a gender through physical appearance, including dress, high heels, high hairstyles, accessories, cosmetics, and manners of speech, behavioral plan, names and personal references, and I guess pronouns now. Also capabilities for boys, athletic capabilities, temperament, willingness to be aggressive and defending others when it's necessary. Maybe that's important to somehow. There's also a reference on the history of gender definition that I found, but it doesn't really give you the definition. It's circular. It's what a person is because of the self-ID issue. This that we have it. The definition of gender identity is essentially circular, which means there's kind of a problem with basing a legal identifier on it, like on passport or on a driver's license. And when you have to show your legal ID, there's a problem with that. I would say to give a definition, I would try to word it this way. An individual's perception of that person's own compliance with the physical appearances, behaviors, personality traits, and functional capabilities that society appears to that individual to expect from that individual. And it may be divided into more than two possibilities and may sometimes result in a desire for medical interventions to change the appearance or function. Gender expression is the general assessment of this compliance by others. So gender expression, by comparison, has a reasonably objective definition as opposed to gender identity. Now, this tends to refer to regressive norms, and in some cases, those norms of appearance can be affected by ethnicity or race. Men for height for men, for example, could be more in some races than in others. Body hair is more for white men than others. There are various things about appearance that can vary unpredictably among different peoples of the world. So it's not very reliable sometimes. Now, sexual orientation, by comparison, may be self-reported, but the meaning has a more precise external connotation, the possibility of being aroused by someone of the same biological sex. And that's something a person reports as an event they experience that seems to have more objective substance than a person just saying, I feel like I'm a woman or a man or something else, two-spirit or something else, and that I feel like my soul has a gender. Now, the idea of a gendered soul may correspond to some religious or theosophical beliefs, particularly when they have to do with reincarnation and quantum theory, even quantum theory. It may make some difference because in quantum theory, everything is, positive or negative in a sense, pairing, so forth. It might actually make some sense and when we get farther into physics, and it may turn out someday that this will make more sense than we thought it did. But right now, there's no real evidence that your brain, there are minor differences, in brain structure between straight people, heteronormative straight people, and then trans men and trans women, and then gay men and gay women. There are some minor differences that are not the same for trans as they are for homosexual. And they're not the same for males as for females. and it's a little bit complicated. And I covered some of that on a video here on May 18th, 2023, and gave you some references to some NIH papers there. I showed you those NIH videos at the beginning. So you can look those up, but it's changing. And the thing about whether the homunculus, whether the map that your central nervous system has of your body, that affects your coordination, your ability to like catch a fly ball in baseball, the ability to do sports, the ability to do mechanical work, coordination to drive, but it might arguably affect your sense of what your sex is or gender is if it somehow didn't, if your brain wasn't connected to your reproductive organs well. Because remember, sex is based on what your predominant reproductive structure is, and that's why it's essentially binary, because that's how evolution works for all organisms, all the multicellular organisms, is to have two different kinds of gametes. It's probably true on any planet that has advanced life. It's basically mathematical. It's how organisms can keep up with the environment, is to have genetic change over time by having two kinds of gametes. Part two, why did the current controversy over gender identity that is develop? And I think there are three basic reasons. One of these has to do with simply getting more emotional empathy for individuals who are not as competitive relative to their biological sex as other individuals are. They don't do as well like boys. They're not as good looking. They're not as big and strong, or they're not as aggressive, or they're not as able to perform the things that are expected of members of their sex, which particularly includes having their own children. That means fathering them as males by having sex with women specifically, and conceiving, and then having babies as women. That's the norm. That's the most normative behavior there is. And not everyone does that. I didn't do it. But in order to have more empathy for people who do not conform, the idea seems to be very appealing, and it's probably one reason why over the decades it developed in academia. And it got to the point we found they started sort of introducing pronouns in the middle of the last decade, and we didn't hear a lot about it until probably after the pandemic. But the use of pronouns gives young people a way of having some sort of favorable social recognition when they're young that they might not have from their own skills. And, I could play the piano, I could do some things to have recognition even though I didn't conform as a boy. So I didn't need that. But the thing that's different, of course, is you're expecting normal people, normative, I should say normative people, really, is a better word, to join in and go along with the pronouns by even being able to say their own pronouns are in letters, signatures, and so forth in the workplace. When academia makes the more compromised persons, if you want to call it that, more comfortable, to have others go along with it, to make every last person comfortable. So that kind of demand did not happen with sexual orientation, because sexual was essentially private behavior, in the bedroom. It wasn't about identity in the same way. A second reason I think is more important is that the availability of information about sexual orientation outside of school from media and even the internet material and books from people like me pressured schools to present material in earlier grades. It seems more appropriate to present identity to small children and to present the idea of sexual libido, because essentially age of consent laws. Remember the days of To Catch a Predator on NBC, how vigorous that was back in for the 2000s decade. Well, that sort of means you can't really talk about sex, but you could talk about identity. Now that seems to be falling apart now in other parts of the world, like Hungary and so forth. That may not fly anymore, but that was kind of the thinking. Um, Fairfax County, Virginia, where I live, has a typical. If you look at their page, it's very typical. And it's very emphatic in how much support it gives to LGBTQ. And then I'm giving you all these references when I post the video, you can look at them. You'll be able to look at them in the description. And then a third reason, by the way, I didn't encounter that when I was working as a substitute teacher myself, 2004 to 2007, but it's another long narrative. A third reason seems to be a little more dangerous, and that's that it's important that others not question the concept of gender identity, that it's real to the person that experiences it, so that you can form a marginalized group and get more protection. And that's what accounts for the vigorous cancel culture that you started hearing about, particularly maybe in 2018, 2019. And I even thought they were mostly talking about when Twitter had the rules for dead naming and misgendering and everything. And I really thought that was about people that were already fully transitioned. But no, it was for a lot of people don't even want to transition, but they want to be able to claim they're the other identity in public. And you can know how far this has led to some disruption of other things that never occurred with sexual orientation. And a non-normative gender identity then sort of replaces the idea that a person had some sort of developmental difficulties, usually for reasons beyond their control, as I did, and usually not medically diagnosable, in carrying out the participation of the collective responsibilities that used to be associated with each biological group. And I sent a letter to HRC. I didn't. I didn't set this up before. There it is. And I'll let you look at it briefly and just I won't read it online. I'll just give you 5 seconds to read each one. You can pause the video if you want. And just very slowly, let's show you the entire letter. Because it's really not public. There's the second page of it. And all I got back was a form letter which all I got back was a form letter. So then where does this lead me? And I seem to have lost the framing from Windows, but I've got it back. I would stand where I stand is I would say don't introduce gender identity and non-conventional sexuality until biology in high school. And that's you teach Harvard versus Bowers, you teach Lawrence versus Texas, you teach Obergefell And then you have to teach what happened in 2022, the threat to Roe and the threat that would come back. You have to teach that to high school students, as well as you have to recognize gay marriage among staff. You still have to do that. Don't provide puberty blockers or hormones to minors except in very rare circumstances. And there's some litigation from several states, particularly Tennessee, and a couple of government documents. And this is the Health and Human Services letter. I'll give you that reference, which quite long, which HRC wanted people to protest. But the thing is, the only thing, if you're not going to allow any medical interventions for minors, then the only thing you can do is talk therapy. So I don't think that's the same thing as conversion therapy. You would have people, if you continue to accept, continue to accept the idea of having some trouble here with the windows coming back. If you continue to accept the idea of teachers, or if you continue the idea to accept the fact that students could identify as the other gender, that they would go into puberty and in gym class or in high school, they would look exactly like the other. So it would be very difficult in a few years for schools to manage this very well. It would seem to me. So it kind of cuts everything out until somebody is old enough to be in the upper grades of high school and have taken all the courses. So then provide more actual assistance to, particularly to men that have, like I was, that have trouble keeping up with the physical requirements. And they could have been a lot more insistent than they were when I was, I would always get a C in gym. And they sort of, because I was getting good grades, I was going to go to college and probably be exempt for the student deferments from the draft, or get a much safer non-combat position if they did get drafted, which is eventually what happened. So yeah, there was a lot at stake in how well I did in school and how well I performed somehow. And I wasn't going to be part of a minority group, and get by just by being part of a minority group. Somehow I had to prove myself, and that was kind of the way it was. And today we kind of coddle students, and there's this whole idea that we've had starting probably early in the 2010s of pointing out microaggressions and trigger warnings and that kind of thing to take the pressure off of students. I had a lot of pressure on me when I was growing up, which has been taken off. And so students are not as fit now as they used to be. Don't allow biological men to play in women's sports where it matters. And you can let the private organizations decide that, I think. There's no reason in chess, for example, women's chess tournament, that trans women couldn't play. Because there's no difference advantage. But in many sports, it's just women's sports. It's disruptive to allow biological males to participate as in women's spaces. I mean, that is very disruptive. And the other thing that's coming down the pike is probably that we're going to have to develop much better age screening technologies for minors' use of the internet. And this is partly because of stuff that's happening in other countries like Hungary that's likely to spread here. And some people like Matt Walsh want this to do here. And that would mean almost any internet site you'd have to sign on with your age, which we thought that was over with the when the Child Online Protection Act, COPA, was overruled in 2007. But it seems like one way or another, with state laws, with about adult sites, it's likely to go to all sites. There is this idea, like in Hungary and countries like that, that if children are exposed to ideas about anything other than the neutral family, they'll not want to form, marry, and have children. And because of the concern over the nation's, birth rate, that's becoming a big deal, and it's sort of spreading, and that could lead to this problem. I've pointed that out before. However, I also point out that although I had access to books, like I had access to that book's Facts About Life and Love, where I learned about latent homosexuality when I was looking in the family book collection in the den when I was growing up. I didn't have any access to pornography. And of course, that's access to straight pornography too. And when I was in the dorm, actually, at William and Mary, I was suspect because I wasn't interested in Playboy or straight pornography either. So that whole argument about exposure to pornography can work both ways. That's a little more complicated than the rate makes it look like, because I didn't have any exposure to that at all when I was growing up. That isn't what made me gay or something. And some of it is biological. Some of it has to do with um, late, experiences in the womb, epigenetics, birth order, older sons, nature's way of controlling the population. But it used to be that in other societies, you could imagine, for example, if homosexual if 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 gay people were regarded as a different sex, they might be required to stay home and support the raising of children or be other warriors to fight to defend the tribe. They might not be able to go out and have their own lives and compete with people who have more responsibilities in raising children, which I've always thought is a big issue. And so that brings me back to HRC, Human Rights Campaign, and their way of grouping us all together as one group, which I resent, because I understand there's a connection, but the concerns are different. In the past, for gay men, one of the biggest concern was, of course, public health back in the 1980s with AIDS, but we found out from COVID turned everything around 180 degrees. There was no disease that could be more spread in a more opposite way than COVID was compared to AIDS, COVID was spread within families by casual contact and affected large families and didn't affect people who lived alone much. And so that public health arguments has kind of been forgotten. But the real problem when I was growing up is they wanted men to grow up and have families and have children. They didn't want distraction. They thought everybody had a responsibility to do that, to share in the responsibility for the next generation and honor the past generation. And that gave people a sense of agency to do that, a sense of a way that they could be held accountable if they otherwise became public people. And that was really a big deal back in the 50s. And I grew up in a stable world, stable society. And it was actually very comfortable, very eventful. But it's a really big picture now, how we come a full circle in this whole problem of gender identity. But that's what I had for today, and I'll give you all the references. And I do thank you for listening.